February 1942. The Empire of Japan stood at the height of its power across the Pacific Ocean. Japanese soldiers had conquered Singapore, the Philippines, Hong Kong, and large parts of China. Back home in Japan, every newspaper, every radio broadcast, and every government poster told the same story. The Western nations were weak. The white soldiers were cowards who would run from battle. But the propaganda carried a darker warning too. If Japanese civilians were ever captured by Western forces, they would face unspeakable torture. The Australians, the Americans, and the British would show no mercy. They would treat prisoners worse than animals. Japanese women were told that capture meant certain death, but only after suffering horrors too terrible to speak about. This was what Kimiko Tanaka believed when Australian soldiers found her hiding in a bombed-out school building in Rabaul, New Guinea. Kimiko was 28 years old and had worked as a schoolteacher before the war. She taught reading and mathematics to children in a small town near Osaka. When Japan needed nurses and support workers for their new territories, the government asked for volunteers. Kimiko went to New Guinea in January 1942 to help run a field hospital for Japanese troops. She arrived with 11 other civilian women. Some were nurses, others worked as clerks or cooks. They lived in wooden buildings near the military base, sleeping 4 to a room on thin mats. Their daily rice ration was 180 grams per person. That was barely enough to fill a teacup. Sometimes they got dried fish or pickled vegetables, but never fresh meat or fruit. The military needed those supplies for the soldiers. Kimiko grew thinner each week. Her uniform hung loose on her shoulders. At night, she could hear her own stomach growling with hunger. Then the Australian forces came. Their planes bombed the airfield first. The explosions shook the ground like earthquakes. Black smoke rose into the tropical sky. Kimiko and 3 other women ran into the jungle, trying to reach the evacuation boats at the harbour. They never made it. Australian infantry units swept through the area, searching every building and clearing every hiding spot. When the soldiers found Kimiko's group crouched behind a fallen tree, the women started to cry. This was the moment they had been warned about. This was where the torture would begin. Kimiko closed her eyes and whispered a prayer for her family back home. She hoped her death would be quick, but the Australian sergeant did something strange. He lowered his rifle and called out in broken Japanese. He told them not to be afraid. He said they were prisoners now, but they would not be hurt. Kimiko did not believe him. How could she? Everything she had been taught said this was a trick. The real cruelty would come later. The soldiers gave them water from metal canteens. They wrapped blankets around the women's shoulders because it was starting to rain. Then they walked them back to a temporary camp near the captured airfield. Kimiko kept waiting for the violence to start. It never did. 3 days later, Kimiko and 47 other Japanese civilians boarded a transport ship. The prisoners included women, a few elderly men, and 2 families with young children. They were heading to Australia itself, to a place called Tatura in the state of Victoria. The ship journey took 9 days. The prisoners stayed below deck in a converted cargo hold. It was crowded and uncomfortable, but they received 2 meals every day. Real meals with rice, bread, and canned meat. Kimiko ate more on that ship than she had eaten in her last month in New Guinea. She shared a bunk with Yuki, a nurse from Nagasaki, who kept whispering that this abundance of food must be a trap. Perhaps the Australians were fattening them up before the real punishment began. When the ship docked in Melbourne, military trucks drove the prisoners inland for 6 hours. They arrived at Tatura internment camp on a cold morning in March 1942. The camp sat on flat farmland surrounded by wire fences. Guard towers stood at each corner. This looked like the prison Kimiko had expected, but when they passed through the gates, something seemed off. The camp had rows of wooden cottages painted white. There were vegetable gardens between the buildings. Children played on a swing set near one of the cottages. An Australian officer with a clipboard read out names and assigned families to their housing units. Single women like Kimiko would share cottages with 5 others. The officer explained the camp rules in slow, simple English while a Japanese-speaking Australian translated. Prisoners could not leave the camp. They had to attend roll call twice per day. But inside the fence, they could move freely, grow food, practice their religion, and receive medical care at the camp clinic. Then came the most shocking moment of all. Each prisoner received a ration card. The card listed their weekly food allowance in precise measurements. Kimiko stared at the numbers and felt her breath catch in her throat. This card promised more food than she had seen in months. But why would the enemy feed them so well? What were the Australians planning? Kimiko's first week at Tatura camp shattered everything she thought she knew about being a prisoner. On Monday morning, the women received their weekly rations. Each person got 14 ounces of meat, 12 ounces of butter, 21 ounces of bread, and unlimited rice and vegetables from the camp stores. Kimiko held the butter in her hands and almost cried. This single week's ration contained more fat and protein than she had eaten in her entire final month in New Guinea. Under Japanese military rationing back home, civilians received barely 1,100 calories per day. Her sister's letters had described constant hunger, children crying for food, and neighbours growing weak from lack of nutrition. Here in this Australian prison camp, Kimiko calculated she was receiving nearly 2,800 calories every single day. She kept thinking there must be a mistake. Prisoners were supposed to suffer. That was the whole point of being captured by the enemy. The cottage Kimiko shared with 5 other women had things she had never seen in military housing. Each room had electric lights that worked every night without fail. Back in Japan, electricity was rationed and brownouts happened constantly to save power for the war factories. Here, the lights came on with a simple switch on the wall. The cottage had 2 toilets that flushed with clean water. Real porcelain toilets, not the basic latrines she had used in New Guinea. Hot water came from taps in the washing room. Kimiko stood under a shower and let the warm water run over her skin for 10 full minutes before Yuki knocked on the door and reminded her that others were waiting. Even the beds were strange. Each woman had her own metal frame bed with a real mattress, 2 blankets, and a pillow stuffed with feathers. Kimiko had not slept on anything softer than a straw mat in over a year. 3 weeks into her imprisonment, Kimiko developed a painful infection in her left foot. She had cut it on a rock during the jungle escape in New Guinea, and the wound never healed properly. The skin around the cut turned red and swollen. Yellow pus leaked from the edges. Walking became difficult. Yuki insisted she visit the camp medical clinic even though Kimiko was terrified. What would Australian doctors do to a Japanese prisoner? But the pain grew worse, so she finally limped to the small hospital building near the camp's main gate. An Australian nurse named Margaret examined her foot with gentle hands. She spoke no Japanese, but her touch was careful and kind. Margaret cleaned the wound with iodine that stung but felt cool afterward. Then she opened a small glass vial and showed Kimiko a white powder. Through a translator, Margaret explained this was penicillin, a new medicine that could fight infections. Kimiko had never heard of it. Japanese military hospitals did not have access to this drug. Margaret mixed the powder with water and injected it into Kimiko's arm. Within 3 days, the swelling went down. Within a week, the wound started to close. Kimiko kept staring at her healing foot and wondering how the enemy had medicine that could work such miracles. The camp allowed activities that seemed impossible for a prison. Women could tend vegetable gardens between the cottages. They grew tomatoes, lettuce, and beans. The Australian guards provided seeds, tools, and fertilizer. Some women started craft workshops where they made baskets and pottery from clay dug up near the fence line. A small shop operated inside the camp where prisoners could buy soap, thread, and writing paper using credits they earned from camp work assignments. Kimiko got a job in the camp kitchen washing dishes for 3 hours each morning. The pay was tiny, just a few credits per week, but it was still payment for labor. Enemy prisoners were being paid wages. Nothing in the propaganda had prepared her for this. One afternoon in April, a white truck with a red cross painted on its side pulled up to the camp gates. Kimiko watched from her cottage window as representatives from the International Red Cross walked through the camp with clipboards. They inspected the kitchens, the medical clinic, the housing units, and the children's school. They interviewed prisoners in private, asking questions about food quality, medical treatment, and living conditions. In Japanese camps, Red Cross visits were blocked. The military did not allow foreign observers to see how prisoners lived, but here in Australia, these inspectors walked freely and wrote down everything they saw. After they left, the prisoners whispered among themselves late into the night. Why would the Australians allow outsiders to inspect their prison camps unless they had nothing to hide? The mail system confused Kimiko most of all. Every 2 weeks, prisoners could write letters home to Japan. The letters were read by camp censors who blocked out any military information, but personal news was allowed through. Kimiko wrote to her sister in Osaka, keeping the message simple. She said she was alive, healthy, and being treated fairly. She did not mention the abundance of food or the medical care because she worried her sister would think she had lost her mind. 2 months later, a letter came back. Her sister had received the message. The camp allowed enemy prisoners to communicate with their families during wartime. This small act of humanity cracked something deep inside Kimiko's understanding of the world. She began to wonder if everything else she had been told about the Western enemy was just as wrong. December 1943. Kimiko had been a prisoner at Tatura camp for 21 months. The war continued to rage across the Pacific, but inside the camp's wire fences, life had settled into a strange kind of normalcy. Kimiko worked in the camp kitchen every morning, tended her small vegetable garden in the afternoons, and wrote letters to her sister once every 2 weeks. She had stopped waiting for the torture that never came. But she had not yet allowed herself to think deeply about what all of this meant. That would require facing truths too painful to accept. Christmas Day arrived on a Saturday. The camp held a small Christian minority among the prisoners, mostly families from Manila who had been working in Japanese territories when the war started. The Australian camp commander announced that everyone would receive a special holiday meal regardless of their religion. Kimiko did not understand Christmas beyond knowing it was an important Western celebration. She expected perhaps a small extra portion of food, nothing more. What happened instead broke something fundamental in her understanding of the world. The camp kitchen prepared a feast. Each prisoner received a full plate with roasted chicken, mashed potatoes swimming in rich gravy, fresh green beans, and thick slices of white bread with real butter. Kimiko stared at her plate and tried to calculate the calories. This single meal contained at least 1,200 calories, maybe more. That was more food than Japanese civilians back home received in an entire day. The chicken alone weighed 8 ounces of pure meat. She had not seen this much meat on one plate since before the war started. But the meal was not finished. The guards brought out dessert. Each prisoner got a bowl of plum pudding soaked in sweet sauce, along with a slice of fruitcake dense with raisins and nuts. Kimiko ate slowly, savoring every bite, feeling guilty with each swallow. Her family in Osaka was starving, while she, a prisoner of war, was eating like nobility. After the meal, something even stranger happened. The Australian guards walked through the family section of the camp, carrying wooden crates filled with small wrapped packages. They had gifts for the children. Each child under 12 years old received a present. The packages contained simple toys, nothing expensive, wooden blocks, rag dolls, small picture books, and bags of hard candies. One guard with grey hair and kind eyes kneeled down to hand a stuffed kangaroo to a Japanese girl who could not have been older than 5. The little girl hugged the toy and smiled. The guard smiled back. Kimiko watched this exchange from across the yard and felt tears running down her face. She could not stop them. That night, Kimiko could not sleep. She lay in her bed staring at the ceiling while the other women in her cottage breathed deeply in their dreams. Her mind kept returning to one impossible question. Why would the enemy treat prisoners this way? The Australian guards were not being paid extra to show kindness. They gained no military advantage by giving children toys or serving holiday feasts. They did it simply because they saw the prisoners as human beings who deserved dignity. This realization hit Kimiko like a physical blow to her chest. The Australians saw her as a person, not as a dangerous enemy, not as something less than human, just as a woman far from home who deserved basic respect and care. If this was true, then everything else must be a lie. Every newspaper article she had read in Japan about Western barbarism was propaganda. Every radio broadcast warning about torture and cruelty was designed to manipulate her fear. Every poster showing evil white soldiers was created to make Japanese people hate an enemy they had never actually met. The Australian guards were not monsters. They were ordinary men doing their jobs with basic decency. The real monsters were the ones who had lied to her. The Japanese military and government had sent Kimiko to New Guinea with terrifying stories about the enemy, knowing those stories were false. They had taught her to fear the very people who would end up treating her better than her own government ever had. But accepting this truth created a new and horrible pain. Kimiko's cousin had died fighting Americans in the Philippines. Her childhood friend's husband had been killed in battle against Australian forces in New Guinea. If the enemy was not the evil monster the propaganda claimed, then what did those men die for? They died for lies. They gave their lives to protect a system built on manipulation and false information. Kimiko felt sick thinking about it. How could she ever tell her sister that their cousin died for nothing but political propaganda? How could she face her friend and explain that her husband's sacrifice was based on manufactured hatred? The truth was too cruel to speak aloud. Kimiko started keeping a small journal hidden under her mattress. She wrote in tiny characters to save paper, recording her thoughts in fragments that no one else would understand, even if they found the book. She wrote about the contrast between what she had been told and what she now knew to be true. She wrote about the guilt of eating well while her family starved. She wrote about the Australian nurse Margaret, who had saved her foot with miracle medicine. She wrote about the guard who gave the little girl a stuffed kangaroo on Christmas Day. And she wrote one sentence over and over, trying to make sense of it. We were taught to fear our captors, but we should have feared our teachers. Some of the younger prisoners started learning English from the guards during recreation time. One guard named Robert brought a children's alphabet book and taught basic words. In return, several Japanese women taught Robert simple phrases in their language. Kimiko joined these informal lessons and discovered she enjoyed learning. Robert was patient and funny. He made silly faces when he mispronounced Japanese words, which made everyone laugh. He showed them photographs of his wife and 2 sons back in Sydney. He talked about his job as a school teacher before the war and how much he missed his classroom. Kimiko realized with a start that Robert reminded her of her father, who had also been a teacher. The enemy soldier and her beloved father shared the same gentle personality and love of education. How was that possible if everything she had been taught about Western people was true? It was not possible, which meant everything she had been taught was a lie. August 1946. The war had been over for nearly a year. Emperor Hirohito had announced Japan's surrender in August 1945. his voice crackling over the radio in words most Japanese people had never heard their god emperor speak before. At Tatura camp, the prisoners listened to the news in stunned silence. Some women cried with relief, others cried with shame. A few simply sat motionless, unable to process what this meant for their futures. Kimiko felt nothing at first. The numbness lasted for days. Then the Australian camp commander announced that repatriation would begin as soon as transport could be arranged. The prisoners would go home. Kimiko realized she was terrified. The journey back to Japan took 3 weeks on a crowded American transport ship. Kimiko traveled with 42 other prisoners from Tatura, including Yuki and several women she had grown close to over 4 years of shared captivity. They slept in cramped bunks below deck and ate simple rations of rice, canned vegetables, and dried fish. The food was plain and limited, but still more than what awaited them in Japan. Everyone knew the homeland was destroyed. Letters from family members had described the firebombing of Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and dozens of other cities. American B-29 bombers had turned Japan's wooden cities into ash. Millions of people were homeless. Food was so scarce that civilians were eating grass, tree bark, and anything else they could digest. The women on the ship talked in whispers about what they would find when they landed. Before leaving Tatura camp, Kimiko had taken seeds from her vegetable garden. She wrapped them carefully in a piece of cloth and tucked them into her small travel bag. The seeds came from tomato plants she had grown for 3 years. She had saved the best seeds each season, selecting the plants that grew strongest in Australian soil. Now she carried them back to Japan like precious jewels. These seeds represented something important that Kimiko could not quite put into words. They were proof that growth was possible even behind wire fences. They were evidence that enemies could show kindness. They were a symbol of everything her government had told her was impossible. The ship docked in Yokohama Harbor on a grey morning in September 1946. Kimiko stood on deck and stared at what remained of the city. Entire neighborhoods had been flattened by American bombing raids. Only concrete buildings still stood, and even those were burned out shells with empty windows like dead eyes. Mountains of rubble lined the streets. Thin people in ragged clothes moved slowly through the destruction, picking through debris for anything useful. Children with hollow cheeks and dirty faces begged near the dock. American occupation soldiers directed traffic and handed out food from military trucks. The smell hit Kimiko before she even left the ship. It was the smell of ash, sewage, and unwashed bodies. It was the smell of a nation that had lost everything. Kimiko and the other returning prisoners went through processing at a temporary American facility near the harbor. They answered questions about their time in captivity, received medical checks, and got assigned temporary housing until they could contact their families. The American soldiers were efficient, but not unkind. One soldier gave Kimiko a chocolate bar from his ration pack. She thanked him in English, which made him smile. Then she walked out into occupied Japan and felt the full weight of the contrast crush down on her shoulders. For 4 years, she had been safer, healthier, and better fed as a prisoner than her own people had been as free citizens. Her sister had survived the war, but barely. Her nephews had grown up malnourished and stunted. Her elderly parents had died during the winter of 1945 from cold and hunger. Kimiko had mourned them from behind the wire fence at Tatura, eating roasted chicken while her parents starved to death in their own country. The guilt was unbearable. Kimiko found her sister living in a tiny shack made from salvaged wood and corrugated metal. Her sister looked 20 years older than she should have. Her hair had gone grey. Her skin hung loose on her bones. When she saw Kimiko, she burst into tears and hugged her for a long time. She kept saying how lucky Kimiko was to have survived the war. She had no idea how true that was. Kimiko wanted to tell her sister about the camp, about the food and medicine and kindness, but the words stuck in her throat. How could she explain that imprisonment had been a blessing? How could she describe the Christmas feast, or the penicillin, or the guard who taught her English? Her sister had eaten sawdust mixed with rice to survive. Her sister had watched their parents die slowly from malnutrition. Kimiko could not tell her the truth. The truth would sound like betrayal. So Kimiko stayed silent. She planted her tomato seeds in a small patch of dirt behind her sister's shack. She found work helping to rebuild schools damaged in the bombing. She lived quietly and never spoke about her years in Australia. Most of the other women from Tatura did the same. They carried their secret knowledge like a burden too heavy to share. Some felt ashamed that they had been well treated by the enemy. Others feared being called traitors if they admitted the Australians had shown them more humanity than their own government. A few simply could not bear to tell their families the truth, that Japanese propaganda had been lies, and Japanese soldiers had died for those lies. Kimiko lived for 43 more years. She married, raised 2 children, and eventually became a grandmother. She watched Japan rebuild itself into a peaceful, prosperous nation. She saw her country form alliances with Australia and America, the same enemies she had been taught to fear and hate. She never told anyone except her daughter about her time at Tatura camp. On her deathbed in 1989, Kimiko spoke her final truth. She told her daughter that the war had taught her one lesson above all others. She said she had been taught to fear her captors, but instead she had learned to question the people who did the teaching. Real cruelty, she whispered, comes not from the enemy soldier following orders with basic decency, but from the leaders who build walls of lies around their own people and call it patriotism. The daughter wrote these words in her journal. They remain there still, a reminder that sometimes the greatest courage is simply refusing to hate the person you have been told is your enemy.